Okay, now we come to the focus of our regular weekly journeys around Asia and the journey between the Philippines and China. This is our Philippines-China focus. And it's been 50 days of the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. Uh, Many aspects are discussed in our public realm. Of course, the anti-drugs campaign and crusade, traffic issues, and so on. But what about foreign policy, which is so vital and so fundamental, but people often forget that this is very strategic to the welfare of our nation. And so that's why we have the distinguished retired Foreign Service officer of ours, Ambassador Alberto Encomienda, and he has been with the Department of Foreign Affairs more than half of his life, as I was saying, 40 years. Fresh out of college, straight to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and into assignments in Singapore, as Ambassador Singapore, Malaysia, and Greece. But over and above that, of course, you're known to be the expert on maritime and oceanographic governance. That's unique, you know. And you have this foundation, the balikBALANGAY Incorporated, of which you're the executive director. Before we go on to the other subject matter, as I was explaining, very few people understand this ocean governance. I know this is so esoteric. People feel that it's probably some special field that maybe nobody in the Philippines except you has focused on. Tell us about the ocean governance and why it is important, and why did you take it up?
Well, initially my focus really was about ocean governance, which is in terms of international policy making and national policy making centers on the Law of the Sea Convention. Now, the Law of the Sea Convention is very important for us as an archipelagic state, as an archipelago nation, because it is in the UNCLOS, as we call it, that the regime of the archipelagic state was finally accepted by the international community.
So it was the Philippines that was at the lead of this UNCLOS formulation?
Yes.
Yes.
And if I would have to mention the team of former Senator
Tolentino, is that it?
Arturo M. Tolentino, yes. And at this time, former Solicitor General Estelito Mendoza was part of the team. Yes.
Okay, and is there anybody else in the country that has studied and specialized on this ocean governance discipline? Is it a discipline?
It's a branch of international law, but I would say I could lay claim to that, for the simple reason that law of the sea was not very well known before as an international endeavor. It began only in the mid-1950s. The third conference began only in 1972 and ended in 1984. So it's really a very current international policy direction. And in fact, when I took up Law of the Sea as a specialization in the University of London, that was the first year that the subject was
really?
offered.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody else followed your footstep after you?
Well, okay. In that sense, really, ahead of me was Justice Florentino Feliciano.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
He's ahead of me in that sense. But we talk about the Department of Foreign Affairs. Yes, I could lay claim to being the first in that area.
Anybody in the Philippines that followed you in this field? Do you recall? I don't expect you to know everybody, but
there are quite a few of that.
quite
I
a
would
few
not
now.
want to.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, you saw some of the island images that we have. We'll be discussing several features of the China Sea in particular, because it affects this entire issue of the, in fact, countries that claim that they are a state, when if we go by the UNCLOS definition after the arbitration decision, they are just rocks in the ocean. But we'll go to that. Of course, if we can flash the images of President Duterte engaged in his foreign policy activities, meeting the Chinese ambassador, of course, and Foreign Secretary John Kerry of the U.S. And we can imagine the intensity of the diplomacy now between
Yes.
China and the Philippines and the U.S. And we'll ask the comment of Ambassador Encomienda on all these. Also, there is some progress, would you call it, with the meeting of former President Ramos with Ambassador, or now Deputy Minister of Foreign,
Yes.
what do they call it in China? Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yes.
Madame Fu Ying.
Fu Ying.
Yeah.
But about Madame Fu Ying.
Yes, yes, go ahead.
If we are talking about the present situation and initiative of President Ramos, Madame Fu Ying was former ambassador to the
That's
Philippines,
right.
but more than that, became, as you pointed out, deputy foreign minister in China.
In
but
China.
at her present position now has to do with a membership in the high-level committee of the Communist Party, and that is very significant. You know, so it was Madame Fu Ying with whom President Ramos interacted, and that alone shows, relating it to what the term you used about intensity of diplomatic exchanges between China and the Philippines. Now, it's not felt generally, as you pointed out, but that is the clear signal about what China, how China regards the Duterte administration and its initiatives towards China. But more than that, also that we have to look at I need to point out an early event, you know, when
Yes, please, go ahead.
even before President Duterte took his oath, the ambassador of China was the first among diplomats to call on the president-elect. And the ambassador of China, even at that time, presented a letter of congratulations from President Xi Jinping. On the day of the inauguration of President-elect Duterte, again, the ambassador of China called on the president-elect, this time to deliver a second letter of congratulations from President Xi Jinping. Now, why are we talking about this? Because these are signals, and very important signals at this very start of this new administration, coming from China, who we have been perceiving as an enemy, as a bully, and all these things, you know. So this is the initial reaching out from China to us, which I hope would highlight that China has benign intentions in the region. Thank you.
Well, we saw the photo of the meeting. There was President Ramos, Minister Fu Ying, Chito Santaramana, and Rafael Alunan, and so on. So this is a positive step. Although Ramos called it an icebreaker. So this is not yet a dialogue, or is it it's not a negotiation yet? What is it? Well, diplomatically, what would you call it?
Diplomatically, I would call it informal consultations.
Okay.
But that is how President Duterte and former President Ramos wanted to project it as an icebreaker. But that will also emphasize our starting point at this time. You have to break the ice because of the events of the last 6 years prior to the President Duterte's assumption of office. You need an icebreaker, and President Ramos, I think, is the best person for that role. And of course, it is informal consultations, but at the same time, a very important start for an initiative.
You're a diplomat, so you won't use the terms I will use right now, but some people have seen Ramos as an amboy, American boy, although his later foreign-related activities, such as Boao, it's always difficult to pronounce that, Boao Conference, is that it?
Yes.
Seemed to show that he was open-minded about relations with China, and there is acceptability in China about Ramos. That's why it seems to be perfect now that President Duterte has appointed Ramos to break the ice.
Yes.
Chito Santaramana is a former resident of China for maybe 20 or over 20 years and speaks Mandarin fluently. But Alunan is still seen as an amboy But would he be taking a more neutral stance now that he has a responsibility to perform for the Philippine nation and the state?
Okay, first I want to dwell on BOAO
Yes, yes.
conferences,
Yes, yes.
as you mentioned. BOAO is the equivalent initiative
Davos
of
is-
equivalent initiative of China,
China.
to the Davos,
Davos
meetings.
summits,
Yes,
yeah.
so it's economic oriented,
Yeah,
but it's high level,
Yeah.
and it is being given a very high importance by China. And of course, President Ramos did not go there on his own.
Yeah.
He was invited,
Invited,
and that
yeah.
shows you the regards, China's regards for President Ramos, because BOAO is not a one-off meeting. It is a series of annual
I think
meetings.
it's annual, no?
Yes,
It's
and
annual.
President Ramos occupies a very high position in the context of that meeting. Now, going to the matter of you mentioned the
Rafael Aluna and
yes,
Chito Santa Romana and the team as
matter,
well. Yeah.
the matter of being an amboy.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that would be an inevitable, shall we say, label to any president of the Philippines, prior perhaps to President Duterte.
That's right, yeah.
Simply because of our very strong interaction with the United States, which in fact the United States highlights as special relations in terms of diplomatic relations, but also as a treaty ally of long standing since after the Second World War. So our interaction from the time we became a state, of course, a Commonwealth state under the United States, and later as an independent state, our interaction for more than a century has always been with the United States. And with all these treaties and special relations that has developed, our direction has always been to the United States. We probably never looked at China before, because China during the last century was practically prostrate
Yes.
economically
That's right.
and even politically. So we did not probably bother with China. We were looking to the United States. So inevitably, any president up to this point in time would be seen as an amboy, simply because of the level and volume of interaction.
Yeah. Well, there was some degree of independence being shown by President Estrada. Some people interpret that as part of the reason why he was deposed, no? And of course, even today with President Duterte, there's so much controversy. You have the Times Magazine featuring this anti-drug crusade and putting the presidency of Duterte in a negative light and so on. So some people would think that maybe there is displeasure in the U.S. being expressed in various ways. And is this inevitable with the distancing apparently of the Duterte government from the old model?
Yes. Well, okay. You mentioned the refusal during the time of President Estrada of the Philippines to renew the military bases agreement. Yes. I would say that that was not really distancing ourselves from the United States, but more an expression of nationalism and independent foreign policy, which after all is highlighted in the 1987 Constitution of the Philippines, independent foreign policy. Now, if you talk about independent foreign policy, alliances and even military bases can be interpreted as an expression of sovereignty and an expression of an independent foreign policy, but it depends upon the context. At the time of when President Estrada, really the sense of nationalism and the growing range of international interactions by the Philippines, the military bases agreement, and if I may say so, even the mutual defense agreement might hamper our direction towards an independent foreign policy.
Well, it's amazing when we discuss these things that time flies so fast, and we have to move on to the current events. And the arbitration has been behind us for several weeks now, and it seems, on hindsight now, this is really, this has become a spent propaganda force because nobody talks about it now. But there are residual crises that has not surfaced coming from this decision. For example, as in our informal discussion, you were saying that this was a surprising set of decisions where somebody wins 100%, and in diplomacy, this is unheard of, as I understand from what you were telling me. Is this so?
So not in terms of diplomacy. During our discussion, I said that in the context of international awards, whether by, say, International Court of Justice, you know, or it is not very often that one side wins 99.9%. And also another aspect of that, in that context, is we have 5 arbitrators, and the International Court of Justice, for example, has also a group of, it's a collegiate body, okay? And it is very seldom that no independent thinking or even dissenting opinion has come out in this kind of arbitration, you know. So in that sense, it is unusual for me.
Unusual to put it mildly,
Yes.
it seems. So that is an important factor now that we are looking back and evaluating, and many allegations of unfair conditions. I'm trying to also practice some diplomacy here. Prevailed during that exercise.
Yes.
But it does bring up a real serious question, even to me, when I saw the decision on Ito Aba, an island which is around half a square kilometer in size. Well, the PCA, Permanent Court of Arbitration, which some people would say is neither permanent nor a court.
The court, yes.
Nor did any arbitration because there was only one party. But Ito Aba has been established, and I think we have images to show that. That's Ito Aba. It's around 45 hectares. It's half a square kilometer, and it has its own water source. As you said, 11 deep wells,
Yes.
and I think we have images of those waters being raised from the deep well. But there's the example there. This was deliberately shown, and I think a Filipino media person was also represented in that
Yes,
team that
that's
went there.
right.
Can you tell us more about that event?
Well, even prior to the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the submissions of the Philippines was already public in the public domain. I could just surmise, although inside me I'm sure, that Taiwan, who holds Ito Aba, who is in possession of Ito Aba, must have checked on our own submissions. And in our own submissions, and this even before the decision came down, of course, we have characterized Ito Aba as a rock, and means it does not generate exclusive economic zone, it can generate a territorial sea, okay? So Taiwan, early on, before the arbitral award, precisely brought a group of diplomats, and even President Ma Ying-jeou, that time, yes, made a visit to dramatize that Ito Aba is not a rock. It has sources of water, it can sustain human habitation and economic life of its own. That was the first public demonstration by Taiwan.
So the important character of what can be called an island is its ability to sustain a human community independently. So the issue of water is very important. But that brings up the question of Singapore. You know? But before we go to Singapore, about the other islands of the other countries like Layang-Layang, you were mentioning that some issues relating to this controversy about Chinese reclamation and so on. Layang-Layang, we have a video here, or a picture here. What was your observation about Layang-Layang?
Well, Actually, it was a contemporaneous event when Presidential Decree 1596 of President Marcos
Marcos.
came out.
So 1975, sometime
Yes,
there.
sometime, yes, that's right. Which is which claimed jurisdiction and ownership and sovereignty over Pag-asa Island. Well, Terumbo Layang-Layang is also quite a big marine geological feature held by Malaysia, owned by, belonging to Malaysia. And when we built our runway in Pag-asa, Malaysia, I'm not saying there's a connection here, but factually, Malaysia also built a runway in Layang-Layang.
This is around circa 70s also.
Yes,
70s.
except that Malaysia announced to the world that that development, of course, has nothing to do with a claim. After all, they know it's theirs. Number two, it is not for any military purpose or assertion of ownership. It was for tourism purposes. And we could have done that in Pag-asa, but we did not. And that's the difference between these initial moves of asserting ownership or sovereignty or control over these islands, Malaysia and the Philippines example.
Well, okay, now we go to Singapore. Singapore is an island, but we know it buys water from Malaysia. And we have images of that. And every time they have problems with Malaysia, they are compelled to look for other sources. That's why they have desalination plants and so on. Those are the pipelines from Johor to Singapore. So how Singapore actually will be put in a dilemma if this issue is pushed.
In a way, yes.
That
That has to do, in a way, yes, because that has to do with a definition of a rock as or an island as defined by the PCA. By the PCA, yes. In UNCLOS, it is there are two characteristics that would give a marine geological feature the character of an island. Number one, that it could sustain an economic life of its own or human habitation, support human habitation. So a rock is not supposed to be able to do that. So, but in the definition of the PCA, and came to the point of Ito Aba, the PCA said Ito Aba is not an island, ignoring the fact that in fact it has its own source of water. It's not an island because if you have to outsource, say, water or food supplies, that means you are not capable of supporting human habitation or sustaining economic life of its own. But then, going to the question of Singapore, yes, it's good you pointed that out, because from the beginning, Singapore was relying for its source of water only two sources: a catchment basin, which is not, of course, a well. Yes,
you create it yourself.
That's right, and or mainly from Johor, and as you mentioned later, some blips in the relations between Singapore and Malaysia. It has desalination plants, but it is outsourcing practically 100% of its food supplies because there is no agricultural activity to speak of in Singapore. So how do you define or characterize Singapore now?
So even the swimming pool of Marina Bay Sands, that symbolic, iconic building in Singapore, the swimming pool there, the water is imported or desalinated. And we'll extend this segment for 2-3 minutes because we have to wrap it up, complete it. That puts both the decision of the PCA and Singapore itself in a dilemma. Because Singapore geopolitically is caught between China and the US, and it stands by the arbitration position now, the PCA position. But if it continues with that and the issue is really brought to a head, Singapore will have a problem. It is not an island, it is just a rock, and by that definition, passed by the PCA.
But that is something which, of course, that is a controversy, or this is just for academic discussion. Because the issue really that Singapore is looking at is this practice issue, and whatever takes sides in the PCA ruling has to do with this practice issue. how the issue affects Singapore, I don't think really that any country in the world would question Singapore as a rock,
Precisely, yeah.
not especially Indonesia and Malaysia.
That's right.
But on the other hand, that shows you the flaw in the PCA decision.
Precisely. Because so many people invested their entire sense of righteous possession of these islands and or rocks on the decision of the PCA, which
Yes.
we see
Yeah.
is severely flawed.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, the bottom line there is we won. The problem, the wider and bigger problem is, does it help Philippine-China relations?
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, talking about the characteristics of those features there, I mean, that we may we may be happy about the decision, but the farther down the line, does it help our relations with China and relations in the region?
Yeah. Well, I think President Duterte has taken a correct tact here. He is leaving it behind and slowly moving towards the dialogue. In fact, somebody raised the issue that he is walking a tightrope, and on the one hand saying that we continue the dialogue, on the other hand, he says that we should not forget the PCA decision. But I noted that in his last statement, he never used ASEAN. He used Southeast Asia,
Yes, okay.
and so on. So I can see that he is really slowly winning away
Yes.
from this linkage with the PCA decision. What do you think?
Well, first, as you said, walking a tightrope, that's true. And secondly, moving away from the PCA decision,
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. I, of course, in my career and as a diplomat, it carries on
Yes.
in your whole life. And I've noticed President Duterte, in all issues, but including foreign policy in particular, to be a very practical person. Okay, and early on, prior to during the campaign, as with the other candidates, nobody mentioned the South China Sea, except in a very indirect and shallow manner. But President Duterte, leading to his election, began talking about negotiations. I thought that was a good decision. But after having been sworn to office, he began talking about, with the supposed looming decision of the Permanent Court of Justice, he has to begin walking the tightrope, and that you said, and he may appear to be, shall we say, shifting positions, but no. To my mind, he's very consistent, but he has to walk a tightrope, and things will have to pan out in the next few weeks and months, especially starting with the ASEAN summit in Vientiane in the next few weeks, and tying these two together, the 50th day of President Duterte's administration in regard to foreign policy, which has to be factored into the ASEAN summit in Vientiane, which the president will be attending. That is the time to watch.
Okay. Well, we have to end this discussion. We extended by maybe 5 minutes, but
sorry.
it was necessary in order to have a crystal clear understanding on hindsight of the progress that we have made since all these controversies passed, and now Duterte is on the track to continuing the dialogue. Okay, we'll take this break now, and we'll discuss two recent developments in Asia, and we'll get some commentaries from our guest. Okay, let's take this break.